the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, when he was with us a while ago, saying that they now have a registry of missing persons that is 3,700 names on it, and talking about the fact that the police and firemen missing 360 overall, 300 firemen, 60 New York City police officers, and Port Authority police. Now, the investigation, which, as we have said, is so multifaceted and is taking place in so many areas. Our investigative chief reporter, Brian Ross, has been covering this ably. Has some more news.
More developments this morning, Charlie and Diane. Overseas, in Hamburg, Germany, 8 apartments raided overnight, and SWAT teams expected to hit more places today. This is a location where Mohammed Atta had lived prior to coming to Florida, before he came to Venice and then to Vero Beach. Atta, the man who took training there and was on the flight that first hit the World Trade Center, Flight 11. They've made an arrest there of an airport employee in Hamburg who had a false passport, a false Egyptian passport. Meanwhile, in Montreal and Quebec, authorities there are also beginning to cooperate with FBI agents in trying to unravel the movements of the terrorist hijackers, who are believed to have been stationed and located for some time in Montreal.
And in case someone is just tuning in, tell everyone again the news you had about the American Airlines uniforms that were stolen.
A report from Rome this morning of the theft of 2 pilot uniforms from 2 pilots last April at a Rome hotel. This has been known for some time among American employees. There have been warnings going out. As well, one of the cars seized at the Boston airport, they found a ramp pass, a restricted ramp pass in the car, with suggestions that the people in the car, as we had reported earlier, had been back and forth from the airport several times over the last 2 weeks, apparently casing it. One person suggested to me they probably did some dry runs, trying to get their knives and material through security to see if that worked.
But as you mentioned earlier, and it bears repeating, because this investigation and what's going on sort of comes to you piecemeal, and it's hard to keep track of all of it. But Brian pointing out that these 5 pilots who were training down in Florida had been in this country for 15 months with their families, some of them getting training in commercial-sized aviation planes. And so you would suspect, this Mohammed Atta's name, I suspect, is one we're going to hear a lot. You suspect that this fellow was probably at the controls of American Airlines Flight 11 when it smashed into the first Trade Center tower.
And his partner, who trained with him, was on United Flight 175, the second plane to hit the tower. With a possible scenario, these 2 buddies, one took the first plane, the other took the second plane. They knew where they were going, they knew which tower to hit.
And now raids being conducted in the areas from whence he came. Overall, the Attorney General saying 50 people probably involved in this operation, and they think they've identified everyone who was actually on the plane, somewhere between 3 and 6 people per plane.
And the great concern now is those they have not identified, who they think may have been in the support group, still out there, still at large, still being sought.
All right, Brian Ross, thanks.
And again,
very
because
much.
we want to make sure you have the latest from all of the key locations in New York and in Washington, we're going to go to Cynthia McFadden now, who has been keeping watch at the hospitals. Cynthia.
Diana, I can report what I believe to be the most recent and the latest number. 2,300 people have now been seen in New York hospitals. That is just in New York. That's not including New Jersey hospitals, but 2,300 people have been seen, both those who survived the initial blast and were brought to hospitals like St. Vincent's behind me, and rescue workers who were seen overnight. 8 rescue workers seen at this hospital overnight.
Earlier this morning, at about 5:30 a.m., the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, we want to keep focusing. It's not just the World Trade Center, obviously. There is this other site at the Pentagon, which is so important. And Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, toured that site. And Jack McQuethy is down there now, can give us some details on what he saw. Jack?
Well, Charlie, first of all, the message here is that we are open for business at the Pentagon. The truth, of course, is that more than half of the office space in this gigantic office building, the offices are not open. The smell in the hallway is still one of acrid smoke, but they are trying to get things back to normal. Now, early this morning and yesterday morning, Don Rumsfeld has taken to, before he even goes to the office, going out to the site. And this morning, we went with him.
That was a piece of the building that had been recently finished. Apparently, the new
reinforcements made a difference? These red beams that were added? So they're going to have to drop this section of the building?
They are. They're going to have to find a way. They've been propping up the two sides, and then they're going to have to try to take balls and break through so that it's sufficiently stable for people to go in and see that if they can recover whatever bodies are there, and then begin removing the debris.
How far into here do you wander during the course of it?
Oh, I've been in the lower section over there. I try to stay in places that it doesn't slow down any of the work. There's folks going in the side of the building over there, some Army people.
When you come out here, what does this do to your sense of resolve?
I don't know that it's there. I don't know that it changes it. It's more about the families and the people and the men and women. But you've got a problem in this world of ours with terrorism that is, it's not unique to the Pentagon or New York. It's across the globe. There are a number of people and organizations and countries that have consciously decided to use terrorism to impose their will on others and to deny others the freedom and the ability to go about their business and live their lives. And the United States of America is a free country where everything about us is that everyone can do what they wish and go where they wish and think what they wish and say what they wish. And the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize people. It's to prevent people from having that freedom and to prevent people from being able to enjoy their lives and be free of the others imposing their will on them. So it really strikes very much at the whole heart of our country.
Get away from that. Yeah, let's we walk over on the pad, I guess. So you're seeing a changing cast of characters here as the hours and the days go by.
Oh yeah, yeah. When I first came out here, of course, there was no one here except about 6 or 8 people pulling some bodies out of the area. The people had been burned badly and injured. And there wasn't, of course, a vehicle here, except there was a fire truck over here that was on fire. It was the fire truck for this helipad that you see. And a few cars were burning, and the whole building was in flames.
The aircraft came from right over
from
here.
over here, hit a light.
A couple of light poles.
Yeah, and then came in about between the first and second floor over here. And it went in through 3 rings. I'm told the nose is still in there, very close to the inner courtyard, about 1 ring away.
So the flight recorder may still be in the nose, for all we know.
It's conceivable.
One of the many things that he talked about during our walk was how he felt repeatedly coming back to the theme of the families. A very difficult time for him. His wife is going to be visiting some of the families of the missing in hospitals and various other areas today. It's a tough time at the Pentagon, too. They are looking not only for the flight recorder, they are also trying to recover additional bodies today. Still many, many people missing at this site as well as in New York, Charlie.
One of the things in all this that's so puzzling, and I think all of us have tried to think of this, how could any human being in any kind of logic think that they're achieving something by doing what these terrorists did? And Brian Ross was saying that the name of the person who was probably at the controls of that first flight, American Airlines Flight 11, was a fellow named Mohammed Atta. Just to get some sense, of what the mind of the terrorist may be like. We asked Brian Jenkins to join us this morning. He's somebody that we talk often about issues that involve terrorism, and he's joining us again this morning. Brian, it's good to see you again. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. But how do you try to figure what's going on in somebody's mind like that?
Well, it is difficult. I mean, you have to keep in mind that we're dealing here with religious fanaticism, and in that set of beliefs, these attackers believe that they have the approval of God, that they are doing God's work, and that, in a sense, puts them beyond all considerations of morality as we would define it. They are answering to their sole constituent, and that is not on this planet.
But to follow that logic, to believe that, you have to believe that there is a God that condones mass murder.
It certainly is a perversion of religious belief as we will see it. Unfortunately, in the history of a number of religions, there are examples of fanaticism where death and destruction were waged in God's name, whether that was Islam or a Christian God or other religious beliefs. I mean, history is full of atrocities carried out in the name of religious belief.
You know, at these times, we always have these visceral reactions, and a lot of people say, this is fundamentalist Islam, and people tend to turn against the religion itself. How much of this, and what would you say to people who do that, is about a kind of I guess, ferocity inside Islam, really, and how much of it is just politics and about the ancient grievance about Israel, well, not so ancient, I guess from the 1940s on, against the United States?
Well, first of all, there is no religion that has a monopoly on ferocity. As I say, we can go back in the history of a number of religions and find examples of this. It is a perversion of religion. And clearly, in many cases, religion is being used as a framework, as an excuse, as a basis for pursuing other agendas. I mean, I frankly don't see these terrorist leaders as religious figures. I see them as individuals who have perverted religious beliefs in order to pursue their own goals. Whether we're talking about some individual in the Middle East, or whether we're talking about some mad guru in Tokyo who 6 years ago put nerve gas in the Tokyo subways, the issue here is the manipulation of religious beliefs. It is a powerful, powerful tool. I mean, here we had individuals, men, some of whom lived here in the United States with families, and yet were able to come together to carry out operations that they knew were suicidal and that they hoped would result in the deaths of thousands of people. The secret weapon here is not high technology. The weapon here really is that type of fervor that can be created in these individuals. The frightening part of it, really, is that the analysts of terrorism often thought that the terrorist tactic was not something that could be easily exported. That is, that the recruitment and maintenance, the psychological maintenance of a suicide attacker was something that would not survive over time and space, that with time and space the resolve would erode. And yet here we have suicide attackers in this country, living in this country for more than a year prior to the attack, planning this attack, carrying out this attack as a group. That's a new phenomenon, and that's going to oblige us to revise a lot of our assumptions about security.
Yeah, as we've been reporting through the morning, these fellows that were training and getting pilot training down in Florida had been in this country for more than a year, 15 months, socializing with, meeting with, being neighbors with people whose fellow citizens they intended to kill. Brian Jenkins, I appreciate it very much being with us. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take just a second, reset. Stay with us.
This is an ABC News special report.
A little bit after 9 o'clock now here on the East Coast, and just after 6 on the West Coast. And if you joined us right at 9 o'clock, we were in the middle of an interview since we're broadcasting nonstop. And what you're looking at are really some signs just displayed and flags displayed by our neighbors who are putting up a toy store next door here in Times Square. This is a building that's been going up for a few months, and we've gotten to know some of the construction workers. They're wonderful fellows over there, and they have been displaying signs since the first World Trade Center was hit that says, "God bless America," and pray for the victims and the families.
And we said earlier, 88,000 flags have been bought. 88,000 flags
In the United States, just a few stores, just the stores that have been surveyed, and that's the scene of the rubble. That's the New York skyline, and you still see an enormous amount of smoke that is wafting over the New York skyline because there are still fires that are down in the rubble. The construction, not construction, the search and rescue people have been working all night long. There's a few thousand of them in there, and it is very slow work. As the Federal Emergency Management Administration estimated, there is 500,000 tons of debris, rubble, and giant girders to be taken out of there and disposed of from the 2 World Trade Center towers and number 7 World Trade Center that have collapsed.
We're going to bring in another shot now from Chicago as we take you a bit around the country, because the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is open for business. And everybody is wondering when the markets will get back to business. We heard the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, said he hoped, it was just a hope, that in some measure that the markets in New York could be open as early as tomorrow, although a lot of people think that's unlikely.
If you've ever been on the floor of the New York or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, it is madness down there on the floor, and it's sort of reassuring to see right now a little bit of that madness. Right. Things are so quiet, eerily quiet here in New York, and it's good to see a little bit of nutsiness. I mean, the way they scream and bid and get their hands up for the corn futures and the sow belly futures and whatever they are. I never understand what's going on there.
Reassertion of vitality again.
Yeah, it's good to see that.
Good. We should tell everybody again who might be traveling that, as we've said before, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time, is when the air traffic is supposed to resume, although heaven only knows how it's going to resume, because some airports are open, some not quite, some planes flying, some not. But we also want to go to Claire Shipman, who's at the White House and been keeping us up to date on the latest reports about the targets in Washington and the news overnight.
Well, that's right, Diane. There are a number of things happening here in Washington. One of them is people are still looking at an announcement from the White House yesterday that the president's plane, Air Force One, and the White House were credible, quote, credible, that's the word the White House was using, targets on Tuesday. One of the reasons the president spent so much time traveling around the country, and specifically a report in the New York Times that there was a telephone threat on Air Force One that gave them reason to believe they should be worried about that. President Bush visiting the site of all of that damage at the Pentagon. He took a trip down there late yesterday, and he said he had very mixed emotions about being there.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists.
And of course, many here in Washington extremely emotional, as they are around the whole country. Yesterday ended late in the evening with a candlelight vigil in front of the White House. Citizens of Washington called to come by local radio stations. A lot of singing and praying. Diane and Charlie? I'm
sorry. Thanks very much, Claire. We should also mention, I hope you saw it, the Minority Leader of the House of Representatives, Richard Gephardt, Dick Gephardt, a Democrat of Missouri, was with us a little bit earlier in the morning, and we were talking about what the president has sent to Capitol Hill. George Stephanopoulos reported there is already a resolution up there that's come from the president, which essentially gives him open authorization. And as Dick Gephardt said, the president will have anything he wants or needs to retaliate to what has occurred, and has also talked about the fact that he'll have what he needs in terms of financial resources to carry out whatever military activities he needs.
And as we now know from Brian Ross, this has been going on. The planning for this incident has been going on for far longer than anybody knew, and maybe we'll learn even further, way back into 2000. So
I have one of the doctors here at St. Vincent's with me, Dr. Anthony Gagliardi, who can talk to us about the patients here and what to expect from those who are stuck under the rubble. Doctor, tell me first, have there been any new victims brought to this hospital? When was the last one brought here?
Actual victim would be about 30 hours ago. We've had a lot of rescue workers that have dribbled in since the time of the disaster, but actual victims extricated from the site, it's been about 30 hours.
Of course, we're all concerned about how people can survive under these circumstances. Can you take us through the list of scenarios, what the circumstances are down there, what you anticipate at this point?
It really ends up being several scenarios. One, clearly, when the plane imploded, there's a tremendous heat injury that occurred, and anyone proximate to that injury, the likelihood of being able to survive in 1,000 to 2,000 degree heat is very little, a very little chance. Then there's the problem of the actual fall once the building collapsed, and obviously anyone on a higher floor during that time would be almost impossible to survive a crush injury, I would think. Normally, if someone jumps out of a building 7 floors high, at least 50% of those people die. Anything above 10 floors, it's very unusual to survive. So that's a major issue. The other issue then would be if people were in the lower levels or made their way down the stairways to a lower level and could somehow be sequestered in these pockets, as we call them, then they have a greater chance of survival. The problem there is whether they have a problem with coincident injuries, such as being crushed or bleeding, etc. If for some reason they have very little injury and they were on the bottom of the rubble and in these sequestered pockets, then we have to worry about the longer-term issues such as dehydration, which becomes a major issue, hypothermia if it's very cold down there, depending upon where they are, and if they're in a very sealed site, whether or not they have actually enough air over a long term.
Realistically speaking, those who were burned, severely burned, any chance that they are still survivors at this point in the rubble?
And burn, even under the best circumstances in a medical facility, if more than 50 to 70% of the body is burned in the third-degree fashion, the survival is very limited. Without any medical intervention with significant burns, the likelihood of survival is very, very low.
If someone has actually only been moderately injured and they are indeed in an air pocket, how long do you think is a realistic time to believe that they can survive before rescued?
I mean, assuming that the injury doesn't cause them to die, then they would have to survive, again, from a dehydration and an air standpoint. Clearly, people have been pulled out of these similar situations upwards of a week to 10 days later, but that's very unusual. It's very notable. Most of the time, the window that you want to see is somewhere in the 2 to 4 day window, and obviously with each hour, with each day, the likelihood of survival goes serially down.
You are very concerned about the weather. There are reports for rain later tonight here in New York. Explain why.
Well, the water is heavy, and if you add on a 10 by 10 surface an inch of rain, you probably increase the weight by about 160 pounds. So that if the structure down there is unstable, and that's one of the problems that the rescuers have been having, as they move some pieces, it becomes somewhat unstable. If you add that weight to the situation, there's a fear that there can be further collapse downward into the pit that was the foundation of the center, and that's obviously becomes a major issue.
You have been designated the main trauma center now for all rescue efforts. Are you optimistic that any large numbers of people will be coming out?
We're always hopeful that we will see more people. From a real practical standpoint, we would suspect that the likelihood of significant transport of victims that were surviving is probably going to be pretty low at this point.
Doctor, we'll stay in touch with you up for the days. Thank you very much. Charlie, Diane, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Cynthia. We've talked about how wide-ranging this investigation is. Things move so fast. John Miller has new news.
We have some breaking news right now. The borough of Staten Island, the smallest borough in New York, has been completely sealed off this morning. The bridges from Staten Island to Brooklyn, the bridges from Staten Island to New Jersey, in fact, the ferries had all been shut down as police moved their dragnet in. Agents from the FBI's terrorist task force searching for suspects from the attack on the World Trade Center, suspects they believe who were not killed in the crash, who may be still alive as support people who helped out in this plot, located 3 cars in Staten Island today. One, a 98 Trans Am, another, a 2-tone Oldsmobile, a third, a van sporting license plates from the Carolinas, Florida, and New Jersey. Florida and New Jersey being 2 of the principal locations that have surfaced in this investigation where the alleged terrorists came from. They have called for SWAT teams from the New York City Emergency Service Unit, which lost so many of its people in the explosion at the Trade Center. They've also called for 2 teams of bloodhounds, which indicates that they want to take the scent from those cars, from that location, and take it into the, beyond the backyards, into the woods. We don't have that information, but it suggests that they believe that they narrowly missed capturing some of the people they were looking for. But we have been able to confirm with local and federal sources that the action on Staten Island that unfolded this morning actually is still unfolding right now.
Because we're going to go to John Magnuson, who is one of the engineers who helped design the World Trade Centers, and he's joining us from Seattle because that's where his firm is located. And good morning to you, Mr. Magnuson.
Good morning.
What about my question? Did you know how vulnerable the building was?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of points. One, to put it in perspective, the engineering work was done about 35 years ago.
You say you're not old enough to have designed that building.
No, I was in the 6th grade when the engineering work was done.
But you were a very precocious 6th grader, obviously.
Actually, it's interesting. It's interesting because the World Trade Center towers and what they represented was one of the reasons that I went into structural engineering, because of the amazing feat that was done there. First, before I even answer the question, I just want to express how the personal sorrow that I feel for this whole situation, because just like every American, I feel that sorrow, but even more, all structural engineers around the country, they dedicate their careers to designing buildings to prevent damage from all kinds of natural hazards. And when you see an unnatural hazard like this, you just have this horrible, sick feeling and helplessness about the whole situation. It's been interesting because I've had emails come to me from people all over the country, architects and engineers, leaving messages on their website, and they basically said that they haven't really heard the right question yet in the interviews. In fact, my partner Ron Klemenzik and I, we have fielded over 60 interviews about the World Trade Center, and the question hasn't been right yet. The question has always been, why did the buildings fall down? And in fact, the question should have been, why did they stand up?
Well, let me get to that. I'm sorry, let me get to that, and I know you want to answer that. But what is so amazing to me, and maybe we get at this issue by doing it this way, what is amazing to me is how orderly was the collapse of the building. Now, when you look at the World Trade Center as it existed before we lost it, what strikes you always when you look at it is the incredible power of the vertical lines in that building, the magnificent vertical pieces of steel that went up. And what strikes me is how well they held, because the building really fell when it went and could not withstand the kind of heat that it did. It really fell right within the parameters of those vertical pieces of steel.
Well, that's exactly right. And the interesting point is, and what a lot of these emails were saying, is that basically 99% of the buildings in our country would have fallen immediately if they had been hit by a 767. And this building was able to stand, both towers actually were able to stand for about an hour after a direct hit. And I mean, this was engineering work done long before I was an engineer, and I look at the work that was led by John Skilling and Les Robertson, and they really did a phenomenal job. And there's literally hundreds and thousands of people that are alive today because the structure held. It was able to take the immediate impact. I mean, if you look at the idea that if an airplane had had its wings blown off and it had flown for another hour, allowing half the people to escape, we wouldn't be asking, well, why did the plane crash? We'd be saying, how did it fly for an hour?
But yes, sir, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to ask, if I could, Mr. Magnuson, because I know you were there for the redesign after the 1993 bombing, and I want to ask specifically about the fire itself,
Right.
because we understand that it wasn't about the structure, it was about the fire's effect on the structure. Did you conceive of something that might be done, looking back, that could have been done, that could have prevented and insulated a fire from taking the rest of the building down?
Right. All office buildings, all buildings anticipate the possibility of fire. The steel loses its strength. The structural steel in a building loses its strength when it reaches about 1,500 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. And so in buildings, there are two primary means of defense against that. One is to put fireproofing insulation on the steel so that in the event of a fire, it keeps it from reaching that temperature for 3 or 4 hours. The second thing that is done is to put in sprinkler systems. Now, unfortunately, when you bring a plane into a building, in the side of the building, I am sure that the fireproofing was scraped off and destroyed, and there was bare steel exposed. And the second thing is that when the plane came in, it's very likely that the sprinklers were damaged. But even if they hadn't been damaged, they deliver water. And for a jet fuel fire, you need to have fire-suppressing foam. If you look at airport incidents and aviation accidents, they spray foam on the fire. They don't spray water on the fire.
And these were fully loaded planes, and as John and Nance told us yesterday, that's about 14,000 gallons of jet fuel. So the amount of heat that generates, I wouldn't imagine it damaged the sprinkler system. I just imagine that it vaporized it.
Right, and even if the sprinkler system had been working, that amount of fuel, it would have been throwing drops of water on a bonfire.
Just one question before we let you go, and I appreciate you being with us, but we're about to talk to Dr. Tim Johnson about the quality of air in New York, and one of the things that I'm curious about is the amount of asbestos that was in that building.
I do not know. We actually don't have any of the plans at our office. I mentioned there was 2 lead engineers on this, John Skilling and Les Robertson, and Les Robertson was in the New York office, and all of the plans and specifications are in the New York office. But I do want to say one more thing, and that is that in many of the questions that I have been asked in interviews are along the lines of, well, what does this mean for buildings in the future, and should we be hardening buildings? Should we be putting in foam systems so that if there's a jet fuel fire inside a building, that we can handle it? Well, the question is, as a society, how do we address this problem? And it's not hardening the buildings. It's not trying to design buildings so that they can take impacts from jets. That's not the problem, because even if we could harden the buildings, the problem becomes the fact that these airplanes are becoming flying weapons, and that's the realization. And even if you harden the buildings, then you just have to start thinking about what the other targets would be, sports facilities, any place that a large group of people are gathered. So if we're going to minimize this risk and solve this problem, it's not about the buildings and not about high-rises, but it's about security measures related to airplanes and keeping these weapons out of the wrong people's hands.
I don't think it's possible. I'm not a structural engineer, John, but I don't think it's possible in the wildest imagination of any structural engineer who, as you point out, is dedicated to making these buildings absolutely as safe and as structurally sound as possible. I don't think there's any material in the world that you could build right now that could withstand the attack or the collision with a 767 loaded with 14,000 gallons of jet fuel.
Right, you're right, but I'm not sure a lot of people understand that. And even if you take a 767 and say, we'll design for that, well, then what about a 747? Yeah. And what about a few years from now when the Airbus Super Jumbo comes out? What about that? So that path of thinking that we can reinforce our buildings is the wrong path. And in terms of the national dialogue that will inevitably take place in the months and years ahead, we need to think about keeping these hazards, these unnatural hazards, from the doorsteps of our buildings and the doorsteps of our other gathering places.
John Magnuson, it's been good to talk to you, and I appreciate you being with us this morning. I thank you. ever so much.
Thank you.
All right, you take care. We have seen the skyline shot of New York. I want to show it to you again, where you can see that there is still 48 hours, more than 48 hours after that original attack on the World Trade Centers, this incredible plume of smoke that is coming out of, I guess you have to call it a natural, not a natural, a man-made disaster area. And there are still fires burning in there, and I noticed yesterday that the winds predominantly have been from the north and the northwest, blowing the smoke that has been coming out of there to the south and away from the main part of Manhattan Island. But last night, the winds shifted. They were from the south, and you could, I mean, I experienced in only the mildest of ways what those rescue workers have been breathing in, really in volume. But it did make you think about what the quality of air is and whether it's dangerous to people in New York, and most importantly to the rescue workers, who we've seen obviously are all wearing the face masks, but still obviously are exposed to a great deal of